Dulcinea, thank you so very much for talking about the Alt Sex Conference. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Our next speakers are Susan Wright and Russell Stambaugh. Susan and Russell will be talking about the 2020 Consent Violations Survey. Susan and Russell.
Great, thank you so much. I'm Susan Wright. I am the Executive Director for the National Coalition for Sexual Freedom, and I am part of the NCSF research team. And Russell is also a part of the NCSF research team. Did you want to say something, Russell?
I'm also on the board of directors of the NCSF, and NCSF has a long history of being interested in consent, starting from working with the communities to come up with a definition of consent that was semi-consensual, not an easy task. And then we have done research programmatically for many years since then, and this is the latest iteration of that work.
Great. I'm going to share my screen, everyone. Let me start this from the beginning. So we're here to talk about the Consent Survey 2020. But first of all, I want to give a little bit of information about NCSF for those who don't know about it. We are a coalition, a true grassroots coalition of over 100 coalition partners who are membership groups, businesses, primarily in the US. We are an advocacy group that challenges systemic discrimination in the government and private sector services. And we also provide education like this about alt-sex communities for agencies and professionals. For example, we've given nearly 100 cultural competency workshops for victim advocacy agencies in the US to help survivors who are involved in some sort of kink context when they are abused. So the NCSF research is, we have 17 papers you'll see on our research page that came from NCSF surveys or data from one of our programs, along with several of our more recent poster presentations. Our first surveys were originally focused on discrimination and mental health, but our surveys on consent starting in 2012 have allowed us to impact the way that groups deal with consent by providing information on how consent violations are happening, how people feel about them. In all three of these consent surveys, the series, we were able to include the question, has your pre-negotiated limits or safe word been violated? The incidence of reported consent violations has gone down since 2012. It was reported to be 33% in the 2012 consent count survey, down to 29% in the consent violation survey, and then down even more to 25.5% in 2020. During this time, BDSM groups have significantly ramped up their discussions about consent, although we always had consent and safe, sane, and consensual and risk-aware consensual kink. In 2012, there was the naming names phenomenon that happened on FetLife. And that's when a lot of people just started discussing their experiences on FetLife, and with one of the main goals to be keeping people who were serial consent violators from attending these events and parties. In these two of the last surveys, we did ask about false accusations as well. And it stayed in the 3 to 4% range, indicating that false accusations are actually far less of a problem than consent violations. So
let me just add to that a little bit. The reason NCSF is doing this is because we do for our coalition partners what they can't do for themselves. And the research that we're talking about here, for those of you who are researchers and wondering how do you get the money to do this, is self-funded. And it has, the samples we've used are recruited from people who are members of the communities that we're serving. At first we did FetLife, and then we broadened it to people recruited through our group. So this is a good representative group of people who are in the kink communities. They are not necessarily representative of everybody who ever has done a kinky behavior or is off in Nebraska someplace and has never talked to anybody else.
Yeah, this is definitely a review of people who are within the kink communities. So I do want to call out our UNC Charlotte research team. They're super helpful. And this survey, we actually had to kind of stop it short. Normally we'll leave it up for 6 months, but COVID hit. So that was a problem for us. Oops, a second, sorry. So demographics, as usual, the survey respondents were primarily white, 86%. And unlike our other surveys, this skewed much more heavily towards women at nearly 55%, with nearly 32% identifying as men. Normally that's more like 45, and 10% non-binary and transgender identified people. The sexual identity was varied, with the largest group being heterosexual individuals, but that was little more than a quarter of the total at 27%. So really, the majority of our members identify as sexual minorities. And you can see the age category is pretty much what you would expect. One of the new things we asked about was resilience. And these are the suggestions that we received through some open-ended questions on what sort of actions enhance resilience. And the resilience scores definitely significantly differed by gender, sexual orientation, age, living in the US or not. For example, men had significantly lower resilience compared to other categories. Women were less resilient compared to transgender and non-binary non-binary individuals. But you can see all of that in the consent survey report. We also, of course, continue to see the effects of stigma. We're still dealing with a largely closeted population. 20 to 30% aren't even out to their own partners about their kink and consensual non-monogamy. 1/3 aren't out to their friends. Less than 1 in 5 are comfortable disclosing to family or coworkers due to the stigma. And again, you'll be able to see in the report more details on how gender groups significantly differed in their comfort talking to partners, family, and friends, as well as racial groups and whether you were living in the United States or not.
Hang on to that slide for just a second. Well, we are sampling a relatively small proportion of all the people who do kinky behaviors in the country. And the thing to note about these data is a lot of the reason why our sample is such an elite sample and relatively small is because of the effects of stigma. Lots of people don't see it as in their best interest to join a kink group, whether they do kink behaviors or not. It's a pretty good guess from work that's been done by Herbenick and Plus One, published 2015. About 10% of people who do kinky behaviors have any contact at all, either with FetLife, other online computer groups like Colony or what have you, or attend kinky educational events or big events like Folsom Street. So that explains why I'm saying this is an elite sample, and the degree of stigma for even elite people is really quite serious still. And this is well after the DSM changes. I'm done.
So we did ask about non-consensual experiences outside an alt-sex context, so we could compare. And as you can see, 57% said they've been touched in a public place, 34% had been sexually assaulted as a minor, and 33% had experienced sexual assault as an adult. And keep in mind again that this was skewed more towards women, our sample. But when you compare that to what was happening, non-consensual experiences within an alt-sex context, less than half who were touched, without consent, compared to that 57.7% in the public space. And also consent violations in an alt-sex context were 1 in 4 compared to 1 in 3 for a non-alt-sex context. And we're thinking what this indicates is that it does help reduce non-consensual experiences if you're actually discussing consent and making it a priority within your communities. And when you break it down further, you can see the gender, sexual orientation, age, and race groups significantly differ on whether they experienced a consent violation. For example, practitioners who identify as pansexual have reported twice the rate of non-consensual experiences compared to those who identified as heterosexual. But in all of this, one thing to note is that none of the groups differed in experiencing injury during a consent violation. Less than 4% of the non-consensual experiences resulted in injury, which is good. We like that low number. But when we look at the activities, kinky people largely report that they enjoy sexual contact during alt sex, 94% like touching the genitals, while over 90% liked bondage and spanking. But when you look at the non-consensual acts done, less than 10% of the non-consensual acts were bondage or spanking, even though they're so dominant in what people like to do. The highest reported violation was no aftercare, but that also made the top 10 with 85% liking aftercare, which again kind of can indicate that aftercare is often an essential part of BDSM. And if there is no aftercare offered, that could be a red flag. But when you really look at the non-consensual acts that are being done, in total, over 55% of the consent violations that were reported were non-consensual sexual contacts. And so what we're thinking with that is that people are seemingly defaulting to the vanilla norm when it comes to talking about sex. They're not talking about the sex, they're negotiating the kink, but then leaving out the, oh, can I touch your breast or genitals? So we are encouraging groups to do more education about that and make sure to emphasize that you have to also negotiate the sex, because the US has recently revised the model penal code on sexual assault. And in that is section 213.10, explicit prior permission for use of force or restraint. And this is what you need in order to get explicit prior permission. And it's very important for our communities to know about this because it's already being introduced in court rather than the old case law. So that means you actually have to like, you're going to be doing before you do it. These are our papers. Not sure what's, there we go. The first paper from this data set was published in the Journal of Interpersonal Violence in January. We just got word that we have another one in press with violence against women, and we have one under review. So we're looking at probably several more papers coming out of just this data, including we're really excited about the reporting to document disclosure and reporting. And then just for future research, we really want to look at, we want to do this longitudinally to identify why are there associations with sexual orientation, with gender, all of that. And of course, we want a more nuanced understanding of what's happening here. So that's NCSF, ncsfreedom.org. And here I will stop share.
Thank you so very much. That was amazing. Does anyone have any questions for either Russell or Susan?
You can go to our website, you can download the papers. We try to make them really freely available. And if you're a researcher,
could we get copies of your PowerPoint presentation?
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome.
The smart thing to do actually would be to take a look at the NCSF resources page on the website, which has all of those things that we referred to on it. Now, it doesn't have the PowerPoint, but I wouldn't be surprised if after your request, the PowerPoint somehow found its way onto the website. It has been known to happen in the past.
Andrew was asking, what do you see as the most important takeaway from the study? I really do think it was the fact that we were seeing far less consent violations reported about kink activity than sexual contact. We knew there was consent violations happening, but that was kind of a startling thing to us. It is consistent with the consent violation survey in terms of it was sexual contact, but also in the top things are punching, choking. Those are the top consent violations that are happening. And so I think that it's important to know what's being done in a non-consensual way for us to be able to let everybody know. I think that's the biggest takeaway we had.
I think also there are important takeaways from the previous study, which we sort of elided here. One of which is that about 3/4 of consent violations happen to people who are either brand new or in their first 3 years, or happened before they ever got into the kink communities in the first place. And also about half of consent violations, people didn't regard as terribly serious, even though they were troubled by them at the time. Hardly any get reported to authorities. Only about 50 of the events we had described in the 2014 consent violation surveys ever required medical attention, and a tiny fraction of those ever involved approaching the authorities. So you can have a very serious consent violation based on very little, on the basis of how vulnerable you are and having a misunderstanding. But half of those are considered really very serious by the people, and I think it was part of their motivation to report and participate in the survey at all. So I don't want to minimize how serious even misunderstandings can be. But the big revelation from this one is exactly what Susan says. A, how protective and how not protective consent education is in the communities, and also how we have underemphasized the sexual aspect. I'm afraid we've said one too many times that kink isn't really about sex. And anybody who says that their kink isn't about sex is quite likely speaking their truth. But for a whole population of people, it's pretty often about sex. And that's the place where our education hasn't been as thoroughgoing.
Great. Frederick, you had a question?
Yeah, I really appreciate the work you've been doing for such a long time, and specifically the work how you've tied with looking at intimate partner violence and the differentiation between that and consensual kink. So thank you so much for that past research. And if it's still on the website, people should take a look at that. And also, even though theoretically the communities in the kink world are wonderful and emphasizing consent, that does not mean that if you join the kink community for the first time, you should assume that everyone you're going to talk to is going to be consensual. There are people that join the community specifically to hide in those communities and to predate on people. So community potentially is consent focused, but please do not ever make an assumption. Please do communicate and negotiate with people individually.
Do we have time for one more question? It looks like Cara has their hand up.
Susan, you mentioned something about one of your surveys being closed because of COVID. And I was just wondering, were you doing, maybe I misunderstood you. You said that COVID was a problem. Is that because you were doing them in person, doing the questions in person, or?
No, what it was asking about consent violations is very traumatic for people. It riles up all those feelings. And we started getting people who were having trouble taking a survey like that under such stressful circumstances as pandemic shutting everything down.
That's interesting. That's interesting.
And we just we felt we had to close it down. We felt we were re-traumatizing people.
Yeah, I get it. Okay, thank you for answering that.
I would say that COVID has in fact been traumatic for the communities because of its impact on people's ability to meet face to face. And that when the pandemic is truly over, a lot of groups will have changed how they function, even when the opportunity to meet face to face returns. But the issue for us was, how do you support people who are answering these questions? And if too many people were having difficulty, we didn't feel it was ethical to exploit their discomfort just to get the answers to our questions, and we couldn't provide them with enough support. So we felt like they were having the same experience as the surveys we've done in the past that were safer. So that was our reason for pulling the plug.
That's interesting in and of itself. Kind of some of the effects of COVID that were subtle. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question. And thank you, Susan and Russell, for your amazing presentation. If you can hang out, it sounds like there might be some more questions later on that people would like to ask. If you have the ability to hang out, that'd be great.
Yes.